He's built one of the largest healthcare tech empires in the country, but nothing could prepare Jonathan Miles for what he saw that day in the hospital. On the surface, he's every bit the successful CEO, polished, private, and powerful, but behind the suits and silence is a man haunted by a name he's never been able to forget. That name? Lena. It's just another industry conference until Jonathan spots two twin boys in the ICU waiting room, identical, wide-eyed, and wiping away tears. But it's not just their fear that rattles him, it's their voices, the way one of them stumbles over the R sound, just like he did as a kid. When a nurse mentions their mother's name, Lena, something inside him shatters. Who are these boys? Is it possible that fate is calling him back to a life he walked away from? Or worse, a family he never knew he had? As Jonathan inches closer to the truth, he'll have to make a choice: remain the ghost of a father, or fight for a second chance, even if it costs him everything. You won't believe how this story unfolds. Stick around to find out what happens next, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more emotional, life-changing stories just like this one. Jonathan Miles wasn't a man who cried. Not when his mother passed. Not even when his company, Miles MedTech, reached a billion-dollar valuation. But as he stood in the elevator of St. Mary's Hospital, the clinical hum of the floors passing by, something inside him trembled. He was here out of obligation, a keynote speaker for a conference on emerging biotech innovations. It was routine, expected, yet hollow. At 48, Jonathan had built walls taller than the skyscrapers that bore his name. His fortune had come not from compassion, but precision, eliminating emotion from decisions, extracting sentiment from science. The elevator dinged. He stepped out, the polished leather soles of his shoes echoing down the sterile hallway. His assistant had texted him the room number and agenda for the morning session, but he wasn't ready to face another panel. He needed a minute. The ICU waiting area was quiet, unusually so. A large window overlooked a small winter garden, its bare branches coated in frost. That's when he saw them. Two boys, no older than 7 or 8, sat curled together on the worn leather chairs. Identical, from their tousled sandy brown hair to the red and blue sneakers swinging nervously from the edge of the seat. One was crying quietly, shoulders shaking. The other held his brother's hand, whispering something Jonathan couldn't hear. They looked too small for a place like this. He was about to turn away when a nurse passed him, her scrubs dotted with cartoon planets. Jonathan stopped her gently. "Excuse me. Those boys, are they okay?" The nurse followed his gaze and offered a tight smile. "They're waiting on their mom. She was brought in last night. Critical condition." Her voice softened. "Poor kids. They've been here all morning." Jonathan felt an unexpected tug at his chest. "What's her name?" The nurse glanced at her clipboard. "Lena. Lena Carter, I believe." The sound of her name hit him like a punch to the gut. Lena. It couldn't be. Not here, not now. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in over a decade. Not since the woman he once loved walked out of his life, leaving behind nothing but a memory and the faint scent of vanilla she used to wear. He took a shaky breath and glanced back at the boys. One of them was murmuring softly, the word brother slipping out but slurred. It came out bwother. Jonathan froze. He used to say it the same way when he was a kid. Bwother. Until his grandmother had spent an entire summer gently correcting him. It was a speech quirk, small and insignificant, yet achingly familiar. No, it had to be a coincidence. Still, his feet moved of their own accord. He sat down on a bench nearby, far enough not to seem intrusive, but close enough to watch them. The boy, who wasn't crying, reached into a backpack and pulled out a creased picture book, trying to distract his brother. He read softly, stumbling on a few words, but never letting go of his twin's hand. Their connection was magnetic, pure, unbreakable. Jonathan felt something loosen in his chest, something buried deep, a memory he hadn't let surface in years. Lena laughing as she danced barefoot in their first apartment. Her hair a mess, her cheeks flushed, talking about someday when they'd have a family, when their love would grow into something bigger than them both. But he'd let ambition win. When the FDA deal came through, he took the promotion in San Francisco and left her behind in Boston. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She just said, "I hope someday you realize what you're giving up." He never replied. A soft whimper from the crying twin brought him back. He watched as the older one, or maybe just the braver one, brushed his brother's tears away with trembling fingers. There was a strength there that stirred something in Jonathan he didn't recognize, or maybe something he'd forgotten. A nurse returned, crouching in front of the boys. "Mason, Caleb, your mom is still stable. The doctors are doing everything they can." Mason, Caleb. Jonathan closed his eyes. Lena had once said those were the names she'd loved since she was a girl. When he opened them again, Caleb was looking at him. Really looking. Their eyes met. Not just a glance, but a full, searching gaze. The boy tilted his head just slightly, like he was trying to place him. There was a flicker of something curious, familiar. Jonathan had to look away. He stood abruptly, heart pounding in his ears. As he walked toward the conference room, his hands shook at his sides. This wasn't coincidence. It couldn't be. He had come to speak about innovation, but what he found instead were echoes from a life he thought he'd buried, and two boys with eyes that looked far too much like his, and one name, Lena, that refused to fade. Jonathan Miles never returned to the conference room that morning. He wandered the corridors of the hospital in a daze, each step echoing a question he was afraid to answer. Mason, Caleb, Lena. The names circled in his mind like a storm refusing to break. He couldn't get the image of the twin boys out of his head, especially not the one who had looked him dead in the eye with a gaze that unnerved him with its familiarity. He found himself back outside the ICU, unable to stay away. This time, he stood just around the corner, not ready to face them but incapable of leaving. His heart beat a jagged rhythm in his chest as he tried to make sense of the ache building there. A kind of grief, not for something lost, but for something possibly missed. The nurse from earlier exited the ICU, her brow furrowed as she checked her notes. Jonathan stepped out of the shadows. "Excuse me. Lena Carter, how is she?" His voice cracked at the edges. The nurse hesitated. "Are you family?" He swallowed hard. "I used to be." Something in his tone must have softened her stance because she glanced around, then leaned in slightly. "She coded this morning. The doctors managed to stabilize her, but it's critical. She's on a ventilator now." Her voice lowered. "There's no next of kin listed. No one's come forward to claim responsibility for the boys." Jonathan's throat went dry. "They're alone?" The nurse nodded gently. "They haven't left the waiting area. Not once. We've tried to get them to rest, eat. They won't go. The older one, Mason, I think, is trying so hard to be brave, but they're just kids." Jonathan turned away, trying to steady the roar in his chest. Just kids. His kids? He paced, running his hands through his hair. A part of him screamed to leave, to get in the elevator, walk out of this hospital and never look back. But that voice was quieter now, muffled by something stronger. The look on Caleb's face. The way he reached for his brother's hand. The way Mason whispered like he was the only anchor in a drifting world. That was blood. That was his blood. After nearly 20 minutes of circling his thoughts like a lion in a cage, Jonathan made a decision. He walked back to the waiting area. Mason looked up first, cautious. Caleb had drifted to sleep against his brother's side, his little face streaked with dried tears. The book they'd been reading earlier lay closed on the seat between them. Jonathan cleared his throat gently. "Hey there," he said softly, his voice unsure, as if it might crack under its own weight. Mason sat up straighter. "Are you from the hospital?" Jonathan shook his head. "No, but I knew your mom a long time ago." The boy studied him, wary and silent. There was a strength in his eyes that startled Jonathan, too much for a child that age. "Did you come to help her?" Mason asked carefully. "Yes," Jonathan said, then paused, choosing his next words with deliberate care. "And you, both of you." Mason's mouth trembled, but he didn't speak. Instead, he looked down at his brother and gently brushed a lock of hair from Caleb's forehead. "Do you know what's wrong with her?" Jonathan swallowed the lump in his throat. "I don't, but I can find out. I want to help." There was a long silence between them. Finally, Mason's voice broke through, fragile and honest. "Most people don't stay. They say they will, but they leave." Jonathan's breath caught. The statement wasn't meant to accuse, but it cut like a blade. "Won't leave." Mason's eyes narrowed slightly, as if testing him. "Did you used to love her?" Jonathan blinked. "Yes," he answered truthfully, the word as surprising to himself as it was to the boy. "Very much." Caleb stirred, mumbling something unintelligible in his sleep before curling further into his brother. The sight of them, small, defenseless, folded into each other like halves of the same soul, made something inside Jonathan break clean through. "I want to stay here with you," he said gently. "Is that okay?" Mason hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." So Jonathan sat down, lowering himself carefully into the vinyl chair beside them. He didn't speak. He didn't try to take control. He just sat there, letting his presence do the talking. The silence that followed wasn't awkward or forced. It was heavy with unspoken questions, but somehow it felt like a beginning. When a nurse came by to offer crackers and juice, Jonathan accepted the tray and helped Mason distribute the snacks, watching as the boy gently coaxed Caleb awake and reminded him to say thank you. Jonathan smiled softly, wondering how many times he had done the same thing as a child, learning to be the strong one when no one else would. "Mr. Miles?" Jonathan turned to see the attending physician standing nearby, clipboard in hand. "I'm Dr. Patel," she said. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" Jonathan looked down at the boys, then back at the doctor. "Are they okay alone?" Dr. Patel glanced at them, still seated, still huddled, and nodded. "They'll be fine for a minute." He followed her into the hallway, his heart pounding. Whatever came next, he had to face it. Because now, walking away wasn't an option. Jonathan followed Dr. Patel down a corridor that hummed with the low, rhythmic beeping of machines and the muffled footsteps of nurses on tile. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and the kind of institutional sadness that hospitals couldn't mask. He moved like a man sleepwalking through a dream he didn't fully understand yet, only that it mattered more than anything else ever had. Dr. Patel led him into a small consultation room, its beige walls bare except for an anatomy poster curling at the edges and a table covered in tissue-thin charts. She motioned for him to sit. Jonathan did, folding his hands tightly in his lap to keep them from shaking. "She's stable, but still in critical condition," Dr. Patel said gently, sitting across from him. "The cardiac arrest caused some oxygen loss, but we're hopeful. We've induced a coma to help her recover. Her prognosis will depend on how her body responds over the next 48 hours. Jonathan nodded slowly, the words heavy but manageable. "Is there anything she needs? Equipment, specialists? Whatever it is, I'll handle it." Dr. Patel arched a brow. "And you are—" The question hung awkwardly in the air. Jonathan cleared his throat. "I'm a friend from years ago." She seemed to weigh that, then reached for the chart. "Well, friend or not, you might want to prepare yourself. Lena's been listed here under financial hardship, no insurance. The hospital's been covering what it can. Jonathan blinked. No insurance? Dr. Patel looked at him more carefully now. Are you saying you didn't know? He shook his head, stunned. The Lena he'd known had been fiercely self-reliant, independent to a fault, but he also remembered her pride, her refusal to ask for help, even when she needed it most. No, I didn't. Dr. Patel sighed. There's something else. When she was admitted, the boys gave the front desk her full name, Lena Carter Miles. Jonathan's breath hitched. Miles. His name. He stared at the doctor, heart racing. What did you say? She repeated the name with slow precision. Lena Carter Miles. That's how she registered. It's on the intake file. His mind reeled. That's impossible. We were never married. Dr. Patel's eyes narrowed slightly, curious now. Then it may have been a mistake, or maybe not. The doctor stood, giving him a moment to process. For what it's worth, she said kindly, those boys? They've clung to the idea that their mom's going to wake up any minute. I hope, if you're planning to stay, that you give them something to hold on to. Jonathan sat in stunned silence as she left. Lena Carter Miles. He whispered it again under his breath, as if saying it aloud might change the past. As if somewhere in that one impossible detail lay a truth he hadn't been ready to see. Outside the consultation room, he walked slowly back toward the ICU waiting area, mind spiraling. There had been a letter once, years ago. One of his assistants had intercepted it, labeled it non-urgent personal mail, and buried it under contracts and annual reports. He remembered seeing Lena's handwriting on the envelope, elegant and slanted, and feeling a jolt in his chest. But he hadn't opened it. He had never opened it. And now, two small boys with his deep-set eyes and the same stubborn set to their jaw sat outside a hospital room waiting for a woman he had once loved more than life to wake up. Jonathan rounded the corner to find Mason sitting upright again, while Caleb quietly colored in a wrinkled sketchbook. The crayons had seen better days. One was wrapped in tape, another was worn down to a nub. He approached slowly, crouching beside them. I talked to the doctor, Jonathan said gently. She said your mom is resting. Her body's working hard to heal, but she's stable. Mason's eyes searched his face, then nodded once. Thank you for asking. Jonathan nodded back. Of course, that's what friends do, right? Caleb looked up, squinting slightly. Are you Mom's friend? From before? Jonathan blinked. Why do you ask? Caleb shrugged. You talk like you know her, and your voice. It sounds a little like hers, when she reads bedtime stories. Jonathan's heart wrenched. Yeah, I knew her a long time ago. Mason's gaze intensified. Do you know our dad? The question dropped like a hammer between them. Jonathan opened his mouth, but no words came. He wasn't ready, not yet, not without knowing more, not without being sure. I don't, he said quietly, the lie slipping out too fast to catch. Mason frowned, but didn't press. It's okay. Mom said maybe one day he'll find us. Jonathan felt that like a punch to the ribs. Maybe one day. He looked at these two fragile pieces of a life he might have had, and he made a silent promise. You found me first. Now I'll never stop looking back. He stood, gently patting Caleb's shoulder. How about I get you both something from the cafeteria? Maybe hot chocolate. Mason hesitated. Okay, but we stay here, in case Mom wakes up. Jonathan nodded solemnly. I'll bring it here. Don't go anywhere. As he walked toward the elevators, his phone buzzed. It was a missed call from Martin Hollis, his lead investor, probably wondering why Jonathan had ghosted an $80 million pitch that morning. But Jonathan didn't call him back. He had more important things to do. Jonathan sat alone in the hospital cafeteria, 2 steaming cups of hot chocolate between his hands. Foam swirled atop the lids, untouched. His phone lay face down on the table, buzzing occasionally with messages he had no intention of answering. The walls around him echoed with quiet conversations, the soft hum of vending machines, the scrape of chairs on linoleum, all background noise to the storm in his chest. He didn't know what shook him more, the boys' uncanny resemblance to him or the way they looked at him, as if some small part of them already knew. The last time he'd seen Lena, they were both different people, young, ambitious, driven by love and fear in equal measure. She had whispered dreams into his ear back then, about building a life, having a family, doing it all on their terms. He'd kissed her hair, told her he needed just a few more years, a few more zeros on the company's valuation. Later, he'd said. But later had turned into never. Jonathan ran a hand over his face. When the board offered him full control after his third acquisition, he'd celebrated by buying a brownstone and upgrading his office, not by calling Lena. By then, she'd already stopped trying. One day, her number changed. And a few months after that, the letter, unopened, untouched, buried under ambition. He rose, grabbing the cups. The boys were waiting. As he stepped back into the ICU corridor, he noticed Mason and Caleb right where he'd left them, sitting cross-legged on the floor near the nurse's station. They looked up, and Caleb's eyes lit up at the sight of the cups. "I told you he'd come back," Caleb said, nudging his brother. Mason said nothing, just took his cup with a small nod. "Thanks." Jonathan handed the second to Caleb, who sipped immediately and winced. "Too hot," he muttered, smiling anyway. Jonathan sat down beside them, close but not too close. He wanted them to feel his presence without feeling pressured. "What grade are you guys in?" he asked, keeping his voice light. "Third," Mason answered, "but Caleb's better at reading. I'm good at math, though. I like science," Caleb added, his voice soft but eager. "We made a volcano once that actually exploded." Jonathan laughed, surprised by how easily it came. "Exploded, huh? That sounds like an impressive science fair." Caleb shrugged proudly. "It wasn't for school. Mom helped us do it in the kitchen. We made a mess, but she didn't get mad." Mason's expression softened. She laughed, said the carpet always needed replacing anyway. Their smiles faded a little, like the memory had brushed something too tender. The silence stretched, gentle, but thick with emotion. Jonathan cleared his throat. "She sounds like a good mom." "The best," Mason said quickly, defensive now. "She works all the time. She never lets us see when she's tired." Jonathan nodded slowly. "That's not easy, working that hard and still making time." "She used to sing us to sleep," Caleb said wistfully, "even when she got home late." A lump formed in Jonathan's throat. He could picture it vividly. Lena walking into a dark apartment after a long shift, her voice tired but soft as she knelt beside her boys' beds. He tried to imagine what she must have felt in those moments. Pride, exhaustion, maybe even a flicker of resentment for a dream she'd once had and left behind. "She's strong," Jonathan said quietly, "stronger than anyone I've ever known." Mason looked over at him, studying his face like a puzzle missing one piece. "Do you really know her?" Jonathan met the boy's gaze and forced himself not to look away. "Yes," he said after a pause, "a long time ago, before either of you were born." "Did you love her?" Caleb asked, without hesitation. Jonathan's heart squeezed. It was a child's question, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. "Yes," he said honestly, "very much." Both boys went quiet. Then Mason, after a moment, whispered, "Do you still?" Jonathan didn't answer, not because he didn't know, but because everything inside him screamed yes, and he didn't want to say it until he had the right to. A nurse stepped out of Lena's room, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Miles?" Jonathan stood reflexively. "Yes?" "She's showing signs of response. Very small movements, but it's promising. The boys scrambled to their feet, hopeful sparks lighting their faces. "Can we see her?" Caleb asked breathlessly. The nurse smiled gently. "Not just yet, but soon." Jonathan looked at her, then back at the boys. "Thank you," he said, barely able to contain the relief flooding his chest. As the nurse walked away, Mason tugged at his sleeve. "You should be there when she wakes up. You were important to her." Jonathan swallowed hard. "I hope I still am." That night, he didn't go home. He called his assistant, told her to reschedule everything for the next 72 hours. Then he found a chair near Lena's room and sat, eyes trained on the small window. The hospital hummed with quiet activity. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped. The boys had finally fallen asleep curled up beside each other on a bench. And Jonathan? He stayed right there, hand resting on his knee, heart whispering a silent prayer. "Come back, Lena. Please. Come back and tell me everything I should have listened to the first time." The soft beeping of monitors was the only sound in the ICU room, a rhythm that had become both comfort and torment. Jonathan sat motionless in the corner, his frame hunched forward, eyes fixed on Lena. A pale blue hospital blanket lay across her body, her skin ashen against the white sheets. The fluorescent light above buzzed faintly, but it couldn't mask the fragile peace on her face. Outside, the late afternoon sun dipped behind the skyline, washing the window in golden light. Jonathan hadn't moved in hours. His suit jacket was draped across the back of the chair. The boys had been taken home by a nurse named Caroline, who'd kindly volunteered when Ruth's shift ended. They had cried quietly when told they couldn't stay through the night. Jonathan promised he would call the moment anything changed. He hadn't slept. His phone buzzed once, then again. Texts, emails, missed calls. But none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered lay just 10 feet in front of him, breathing so faintly it was as if her spirit hovered somewhere between here and a place he couldn't reach. And then, as if breaking the veil between that place and this one, Lena's fingers twitched. Jonathan sat upright, disbelief catching in his throat. He blinked, afraid he'd imagined it. But then, again, slight movement. Her eyelids fluttered, brows furrowing slightly like someone waking from a deep dream they weren't ready to leave. He stood, cautiously, afraid even a breath might shatter the moment. "Lena?" His voice cracked, tentative but laced with quiet desperation. "Lena, it's me. Jonathan." A small sound escaped her lips, barely a whisper, but it was real. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, scanning the ceiling. Then they settled on him, and she blinked once. Recognition flared across her face like dawn breaking through cloud cover. "Jonathan," she rasped, voice barely audible, her lips dry. He was beside her in an instant, his hand hovering over hers but not touching, not yet. He didn't want to overwhelm her. "I'm here. You're okay. You're safe." Lena swallowed with difficulty, her throat parched. He quickly poured water from the bedside jug and helped her sip through a straw, his hands trembling. She took in just enough to speak, her voice still faint but growing steadier. "The boys. Where?" "They're safe," Jonathan assured her gently. "Caroline took them home for the night. They didn't want to leave." Lena exhaled slowly, relief softening her features. Her hand, pale and slightly trembling, reached for his. He took it, holding it like something sacred. They saw you?" she asked, eyes searching his. "Yes." His voice was low but certain. "I saw them. I saw you. In them. Lena. You believe me now," she said, not accusing, but stating it with a quiet ache. "It only took you 9 years." Jonathan looked down, ashamed. "I deserved that." There was a long pause. Machines continued their steady rhythm, but everything else felt suspended in that fragile moment. "I tried, Jonathan," Lena whispered, eyes misting. I wrote. I called. I even showed up once at your office. Your assistant said you were in Zurich. I waited 3 hours. His breath caught. He remembered that day. He had been in Zurich, closing a deal, celebrating over cocktails while the mother of his children sat in a lobby, believing she wasn't worth his time. I thought I was doing what was best, he said hoarsely. I thought you lied to me. I thought I couldn't be a father, that it wasn't possible. She nodded slowly, no longer with anger, but weariness. You were so certain, and I didn't have the energy to fight you and the world. I was wrong, he said, the words heavy with regret. So wrong. About you, about everything. And I missed, Lena. I missed everything. Their first steps, their first words, their first scraped knees, their bedtime stories. I missed it all. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks. They asked about you, you know. Mason said once, maybe he's a soldier and got stuck in a secret mission. Caleb said you were probably an astronaut. Jonathan's lips trembled. And what did you tell them? I said, you loved them once, but life had different plans. Her voice wavered. I didn't want them to hate you. He broke then, just enough to lean forward and press his forehead gently against her hand. I didn't deserve your kindness. No, she murmured, but they do. I want to make this right, he said, lifting his gaze to hers. I know I can't undo the past, but I'll do anything to be a part of their lives now, if you'll let me. Lena studied him, her eyes clear despite the exhaustion. It's not up to me anymore, she said softly. It's up to them. You have to earn them, Jonathan, not with gifts, with time. I will, he promised, his voice cracking. I swear, I will. As the sun set behind the city skyline, casting long shadows across the hospital walls, something shifted. The years of pain between them didn't disappear, but they bent slightly, made space for something new. And in that quiet hospital room, filled with hums and heartbeats and hushed forgiveness, a second chance was born. The apartment smelled like cinnamon and burnt toast. Jonathan's first solo attempt at breakfast for the twins had gone slightly sideways. He stood over the stove, sleeves rolled up, spatula in one hand, his other hand pressing down on the toaster's stubborn lever. The kitchen, modest but warm, hummed with a kind of chaos he wasn't used to. It was Saturday, and Lena, still regaining her strength, sat at the small dining table, sipping tea with a quiet smile that said more than words ever could. Mason and Caleb were on the floor, racing toy cars along imaginary highways made of books and cereal boxes. You know, Lena said gently, you don't have to cook. They'd be just as happy with cereal. Jonathan grinned sheepishly as smoke curled from the toaster. I said I'd help. I meant it. Even if it means sacrificing a few slices of bread in the process. You've already lost a spatula, she teased, nodding at the melted end now misshapen beyond salvation. Battle scars, he said with mock bravado, holding it up like a war trophy. From the front lines of fatherhood. At that, Caleb looked up. You're not really a soldier, right? Jonathan crouched beside him, lowering his voice like they were sharing a secret. Nope, but I'm fighting a different kind of battle now. What kind? Mason asked, rolling a car into Jonathan's foot. The kind where I have to prove I can be someone worth trusting, he replied sincerely. Someone who sticks around. Both boys studied him silently. Then Caleb asked, Do you know how to read stories? Good ones? With voices? Jonathan laughed. I might need some practice, but yeah, I can do voices. Even pirate ones? Mason challenged. Especially pirate ones. Later that night, with the twins nestled in their bunk beds and the room aglow with a nightlight shaped like a rocket ship, Jonathan sat between them holding a worn copy of Treasure Island. He cleared his throat, putting on his best gravelly sea captain's voice. Arr, matey, Beware the treasure cursed by Blackbeard himself. Mason giggled. Caleb tucked the blanket under his chin, eyes wide. For the first time, Jonathan didn't feel like an imposter in their lives. He felt included, needed. After the story ended, and the room quieted with the rhythm of even breathing, Jonathan stepped into the hallway where Lena stood waiting. Her arms were crossed, but not defensively, just folded like someone trying to stay steady. "You're good at this," she said softly. "I'm fumbling through it," he admitted, "but it feels right." She nodded, then looked away, her voice quieter now. "They're getting attached." "I want them to," he replied, his voice firm but kind. "Then don't leave. Not again." The words hit him harder than he expected. "I'm not going anywhere." Lena hesitated, then reached into a drawer and handed him a wrinkled sheet of notebook paper. "Mason wrote this today." Jonathan unfolded it carefully. A stick-figure family. 2 boys, a mom, and a tall man holding hands with both kids. Above the picture, in shaky letters, it read, "I wish he was our dad." His throat tightened as he stared at the drawing. "They deserve the truth," he said eventually. "They do," Lena agreed, "but they also deserve time, stability. You've only been back a few weeks. Let them lead." Jonathan nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll follow their pace." The following days were a mix of trial and error. He tried tying shoes, ended up with uneven bunny ears. He packed lunches, forgot the juice boxes. He helped with homework, realized 3rd-grade math was no joke. But slowly, a rhythm formed. He learned that Mason liked his peanut butter spread all the way to the edges, that Caleb hated loud noises but loved shadow puppets on the wall at bedtime. He learned how to fold tiny socks and how to answer questions like, "Why is the moon following us?" and "Can you build a rocket in real life?" He also learned how to apologize when he got it wrong. "Sorry, bud," he said one morning after snapping at Caleb in a moment of stress. "That wasn't fair." Caleb nodded seriously. "It's okay. Mom says grown-ups mess up too." "Yeah," Jonathan said with a sigh. "We really do." One night, as Lena sat reading quietly in the living room, Jonathan found himself alone in the boys' room. Caleb had already fallen asleep, his hand clutching a Lego figure, but Mason lay awake, staring at the ceiling. "You okay?" Jonathan asked, kneeling beside the bed. Mason turned, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wish you were our dad." Jonathan's heart cracked open. "Me too," he said, gently brushing hair from the boy's forehead. "More than anything." Mason studied him with serious eyes. "Could we pretend you are? Just for now?" Jonathan swallowed the lump in his throat. "Yeah, buddy, we can pretend." But deep down, he knew. This wasn't pretend anymore. This was real, and it mattered more than anything he'd ever built, signed, or achieved. This was his life now, his family, his chance. The days following Mason's quiet confession unfolded like a dream Jonathan didn't want to wake from. Mornings began with cereal-flecked smiles and sleepy hair tousled by night sweats and dreams. Evenings closed with pillow forts and twin giggles that filled Lena's apartment like music. The once sterile space had grown warm, lived in, real. Jonathan had never known how much joy could fit into the curve of a child's hand tugging at his sleeve. He was learning the rhythms of family life, when to push, when to back off, how to listen with his eyes, not just his ears. But beneath the sweetness, an ache lingered. A tension Lena seemed to carry more visibly with each passing day. It started with a single envelope, innocent in appearance but heavy in implication. It arrived one Thursday morning, slipped through the mail slot between a grocery store flyer and a utility bill. Lena read it alone in the kitchen. Jonathan walked in just as her hand dropped from her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief. "What is it?" he asked, voice hushed. She hesitated before handing it over. "It's from my uncle." Jonathan scanned the neatly typed letter. Legal language jumped out. Petition for guardianship, concern for the children's stability, history of absentee paternity. He lowered the paper, a knot forming in his stomach. He's trying to take them. Lena nodded, arms crossed, her shoulders rigid. He says I'm unfit, that I'm too weak to raise them alone, that their real father abandoned them and I made a mistake letting you back in. Jonathan's breath left him like a punch to the gut. That's not true. None of that's true. He's a retired firefighter, Lena said flatly. Respected, church-going. He'll play the hero to a judge, and he knows my health history. Jonathan paced the kitchen. We can fight this. I'll get the best attorney. You think this is just about legal defense? Lena interrupted, frustration rising. It's about perception, about fear, about someone with a clean reputation thinking they know better than me. Her voice cracked. And if I lose them... Jonathan reached for her hand, but she stepped away, her eyes filling. You've just come back, John. You're still learning how to be part of this. I need to know, really know, that you're in this. That you'll stand up, not just for them, but with me. He wanted to answer immediately, to shout of course without hesitation, but his silence lingered too long. I see, Lena whispered, her voice trembling. That's what I was afraid of. No, he said quickly, stepping closer. That's not what I meant. I don't want to make promises I don't know how to keep, but I'm not walking away. I swear to you, Lena. She looked at him then, really looked, into the deepest part of him. You can't halfway this, not anymore. That night, after the boys were asleep, Jonathan stood alone in the hallway, staring at the closed door of their bedroom. He thought about Mason's words. Can we pretend you're our dad? Pretending wasn't enough anymore. These boys weren't a footnote in his life, they were the entire chapter. He picked up the phone and called a contact from his past, Melissa Greer, a family law attorney he'd once helped during a healthcare investment project. Melissa, he said when she answered, I need a miracle, and I need it fast. Within 48 hours, Melissa had filed an official motion to intervene in the guardianship petition. Jonathan's name now appeared as a proposed co-guardian, and the wheels of a complicated legal process had begun to turn. Lena, though still wary, stood beside him as they reviewed forms and testimonies and statements of intent. I'll testify, Jonathan said resolutely during their prep meeting, whatever it takes. Melissa raised an eyebrow. Even if they question your absence, your lack of involvement until now? He nodded. Especially then. The hearing was set for the following Tuesday. As the date loomed, the apartment buzzed with unspoken tension. The twins sensed it too, becoming quieter, clingier. Even Caleb, usually the more energetic of the two, curled up silently beside Jonathan one afternoon, his head resting against his arm. Are you gonna leave? He asked softly, barely audible over the hum of the TV. Jonathan's throat tightened. No, buddy. I'm not going anywhere. Promise? He met Caleb's eyes, those same amber-flecked eyes that haunted him for weeks after the hospital. I promise, he said, with every ounce of certainty he could muster. On the morning of the hearing, Mason slipped a folded drawing into Jonathan's coat pocket. In case you need courage, he said shyly. Jonathan waited until they arrived at the courthouse to unfold it. The drawing was of a stick figure holding hands with two smaller ones. Above it, in a child's uneven scrawl, it read, You're already our dad. Jonathan closed his eyes for a beat, overwhelmed. Not by fear, but by a clarity he'd never known. He wasn't fighting to prove anything anymore, not to the court, not to Lena, not even to himself. He was fighting because they were his family. And this time, he wasn't backing down. The courtroom was colder than Jonathan expected, not just in temperature but in atmosphere. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Wooden benches stretched in rigid rows. The air carried the hush of judgment, heavy with the quiet weight of decisions yet to be made. Lena sat beside him, her hands tightly clasped in her lap, knuckles pale. She wore a navy dress, modest but graceful, her hair pinned back from her face. There was a raw edge to her posture, determined but bracing for impact. Jonathan hadn't seen her cry since the day the letter arrived. She wasn't crying now, but he could feel her holding back a storm. Across the aisle sat Lena's uncle, Gregory Templeton, gray-haired, square-jawed, a retired firefighter whose face carried years of public trust and private arrogance. He looked at Jonathan with a thin, dismissive nod, the same nod men gave before shutting doors. The judge entered, and everyone rose. The proceedings began with opening statements, procedural and dry. But Jonathan's heart didn't calm. It thundered like it had the first time he held Mason's tiny hand in the ICU. Gregory's attorney went first. He stood and began his argument with clipped certainty. "Your Honor, Mr. Templeton's only interest here is the well-being of the children. He has a stable home, an excellent history of community service, and deep family ties. Ms. Bennett, though undoubtedly loving, has had ongoing health complications. And Mr. Miles, well, Mr. Miles only entered the picture weeks ago." The words stung. Jonathan clenched his jaw but remained composed. The attorney continued, "He's a stranger to these boys, biologically connected perhaps, but no more a father than a man passing by on the sidewalk. Guardianship requires more than DNA. It requires presence, stability, proven care." As he sat, the attorney smirked faintly, like the battle had already been won. Melissa stood slowly. Her voice was calm, but carried weight. "Your Honor, the law acknowledges that the best interests of children include connection to biological parents when appropriate. Mr. Miles did not abandon his sons. He was never informed of their existence, and since discovering the truth, he has done everything within his power to become a father in the truest sense." She nodded toward Lena. "Miss Bennett has fought every day for those boys, with love, with sacrifice, and with grace. Together, she and Mr. Miles can provide not only stability, but the kind of healing that only family can offer." The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Miles, you may speak." Jonathan rose, nerves tangling his breath. He stepped to the front, hands slightly trembling. But when he saw Mason and Caleb sitting quietly in the back row with Ruth, his gaze softened. "Your Honor," he began, voice steady but deeply emotional. "My name is Jonathan Miles. I'm the CEO of a biotech firm that specializes in pediatric devices. I've built hospitals, funded research, helped heal hundreds of children I never knew personally." He paused. But none of that prepared me for meeting Mason and Caleb. His eyes found the boys again, and his voice cracked just slightly. They were sitting outside an ICU, alone, waiting for their mother. I didn't know they were mine. I just knew. They shouldn't be sitting there like that. He continued, more quietly now. "Since then, I've read bedtime stories I barely understood. I've burned pancakes at least a dozen times. I've learned the names of every plush dinosaur they own. And somewhere in those small moments, I stopped being a man who wanted to fix things." He swallowed. "I became their dad." There was a silence in the courtroom, thick and sacred. The judge adjusted her glasses. "Ms. Bennett, would you like to add anything?" Lena stood slowly, her hand briefly brushing Jonathan's. She looked directly at the judge. "I never meant to raise them alone. I just didn't think I had a choice. When I found out I was pregnant, Jonathan had already left the country. I tried to reach him, but I didn't have the right channels, and life just happened." Her voice grew softer. "But when he came back, he didn't run. He stayed. He sat with them, listened, failed, tried again. He didn't try to buy their affection. He earned it, and mine." Gregory rose abruptly. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this man has no proven record of—" The judge held up a hand. "Mr. Templeton, You will have your chance again." She turned back to Jonathan. "One last question, Mr. Miles. Why now? Why not walk away and let someone else take the weight?" Jonathan looked toward his sons again, then to Lena. "Because I was lost for a long time. I thought success meant power, titles, control. But love isn't something you control. It's something you choose, over and over, and I choose them, every day, forever." The judge nodded solemnly. "Court will reconvene tomorrow with a decision." As they exited, Mason ran to Jonathan and hugged him fiercely. Caleb followed, burying his face in his side. Jonathan held them both tightly. "Did I do okay?" he asked quietly. Mason pulled back just enough to look up at him. "You sounded like a real dad," he whispered. Jonathan smiled, blinking back tears. "I am." The next morning, the courtroom felt heavier, as if the air itself understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. Lena sat close to Jonathan, their shoulders nearly touching, but neither spoke much. The tension between them wasn't discomfort. It was shared weight, the kind that only comes from waiting together in quiet hope. Mason and Caleb weren't with them this time. Ruth had taken them to the library to keep their minds occupied. Jonathan was grateful. No child should have to sit through something like this, not when everything about their future hung in the balance. The judge entered, her robe flowing like a dark curtain drawn back on the final act. Everyone stood, then sat. The shuffle of paperwork was the only sound as she arranged her notes and cleared her throat. "This court has reviewed all submitted documentation," she began, her voice firm but fair. "Heard testimony from both parties and considered the welfare of the children, Mason and Caleb Bennett, above all else." Jonathan's palms were damp. He glanced at Lena, who stared forward, expression unreadable. His heart pounded like a judge's gavel in his chest. The judge continued, "It is the finding of this court that Gregory Templeton's petition for full legal guardianship is denied." The breath rushed from Jonathan's lungs. "Furthermore," the judge went on, "it is this court's recommendation that legal custody be retained by Ms. Lena Bennett, with shared parental rights and visitation granted to Mr. Jonathan Miles, contingent upon continued demonstration of responsible co-parenting." Lena's hand reached instinctively for Jonathan's, gripping it with silent emotion. "In other words," the judge clarified, "these children will remain with their mother, who has provided primary care and support throughout their lives, and Mr. Miles will be legally recognized as their father, with the rights and responsibilities that entails. This court encourages ongoing family counseling and monitored integration of Mr. Miles into the boys' daily lives." Jonathan whispered, "Thank God," as relief poured through him like warm rain after a storm. Gregory Templeton stood abruptly, the anger in his expression barely restrained. "Your Honor, this is not open for debate," the judge said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You are free to file an appeal, but I urge you to consider the emotional toll that continued litigation will take on your great-nephews." Gregory clenched his jaw, then sat down slowly, defeated but not entirely softened. The gavel struck once. Court is adjourned. As people began to file out, Jonathan turned to Lena. Her eyes were shining, but she blinked away the tears quickly. "We did it," he whispered. She nodded, but her voice cracked. "They won't lose both of us." In the hallway outside, Melissa embraced them both, her professional demeanor cracking just slightly. "That's the best outcome we could have hoped for. Now the real work begins." Lena glanced toward the lobby doors, sunlight filtering through frosted glass. "They're at the library with Ruth. Do you want to be the one to tell them?" Jonathan swallowed. "Yeah, I want them to hear it from me." The library smelled like old pages and crayons. Ruth sat at a table near the children's section, flipping through a picture book while Mason and Caleb sat on either side of her, coloring quietly. Jonathan approached slowly. The boys looked up at the same time, their matching eyes wide with curiosity. "Hey guys," he said gently, crouching beside them. "Can we talk for a minute?" Ruth nodded and gave the boys a reassuring smile before stepping away. Mason set down his crayon. "Did the judge decide?" Jonathan took a breath. "She did." Both boys froze, like they were bracing for something bad. Jonathan smiled softly, and she said, "You get to stay with your mom, just like you wanted." Caleb's shoulders relaxed instantly. Mason blinked rapidly, absorbing the words. "But there's more," Jonathan added, glancing between them. "She also said I get to be your dad. Officially. If that's still something you want." Mason's voice was quiet. "You mean, you're not going away?" "Never," Jonathan said, placing a hand over his heart. "Not unless you kick me out." Caleb giggled. "We'd never do that." Mason looked down, fiddling with a loose thread on his sleeve. "Even if we mess up?" Jonathan touched his chin gently, guiding his gaze up. "Especially if you mess up, that's when dads stay." There was a long pause, and then Mason lunged forward, throwing his arms around Jonathan's neck. Caleb joined a second later, and the three of them huddled together in a knot of silent emotion. Ruth stood at a distance, watching with a softened expression, one hand pressed over her chest. That night, Jonathan sat in the living room of Lena's apartment, the boys asleep down the hall. Lena poured 2 glasses of wine and handed him one. "To shared custody," she said, raising her glass. "To starting over," he replied, clinking hers gently. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the shadows of streetlights play across the floor. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice quiet. "For what? For not walking away, for showing up, for fighting the right way." Jonathan looked at her, his expression earnest. "I missed so much, Lena, and I can't change that, but I'm not missing another second." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheek. "They believe you, you know." "I believe in them," he said. And for the first time in a decade, Jonathan Miles felt whole, not because of a title, not because of success, but because of 2 little boys down the hall and the woman beside him who had given them everything. Mornings in Lena's apartment had become a symphony of controlled chaos. The smell of burnt toast, the sound of Mason arguing with Caleb over who got the cool spoon, and Jonathan, still adjusting to 7 a.m. wake-ups and children's toothpaste, somehow in the middle of it all. He stood barefoot in the kitchen, wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt with a faint coffee stain, watching as the boys scrambled to get ready for school. Lena had left early for a conference, trusting him alone with the morning routine for the first time. He'd insisted he could handle it. Now, staring at a lunchbox filled with only half of what it should have, he wasn't so sure. "Do goldfish crackers count as a vegetable?" he muttered aloud, rummaging through the pantry. "No," Mason said bluntly, already zipped into his hoodie and looking very much like a 9-year-old professor. "Figures," Jonathan sighed, tossing in an apple slice instead. "Right, guys, shoes on. We gotta go." Caleb sat cross-legged on the floor, still in his pajamas, humming to himself while coloring on the back of a cereal box. "Caleb," Mason snapped, "you're not even dressed." Jonathan knelt beside him. "Hey, buddy, remember what we talked about? You gotta help me out here. Your mom said you're usually done by now." Caleb frowned and whispered, "She helps me find my socks." Jonathan's heart clenched. He stood and marched into the boys' room, rifling through drawers until he found a mismatched pair. He returned like a conquering hero, socks held high. "Let's call it fashion forward," he joked. Caleb grinned. Mason rolled his eyes. "He's gonna get laughed at." "Then he'll have the coolest story to tell," Jonathan replied, nudging Caleb's shoulder playfully. By the time they got out to the door, the sun was already peeking over the buildings. Jonathan gripped both boys' hands tightly as they navigated the sidewalk. He was learning. Not just schedules and school policies, but small things. The way Caleb counted cracks in the sidewalk when he was nervous. How Mason always stood slightly ahead of his brother, like a quiet protector. They reached the school gate just as the bell rang. Mason took off with a shout, waving to friends. Caleb hesitated, turning back. "You're coming tonight, right?" he asked. Jonathan blinked. "Tonight?" "The science fair," Caleb said, eyes narrowing with dramatic suspicion. "Mom said she reminded you." Jonathan winced. Yes, of course. I'll be there. Wouldn't miss it." Caleb smiled and sprinted inside. Jonathan stood at the gate for a moment, exhaling deeply. Somewhere in his old life, a meeting was probably starting. A dozen unread emails waited, but for the first time, none of that pulled at him. That evening, the cafeteria buzzed with children's laughter, glittery trifold displays, and the unmistakable smell of elementary school pizza. Jonathan scanned the rows of projects until he spotted the boys. Caleb bouncing in excitement, Mason leaning against the table trying to look unimpressed. "There he is!" Caleb shouted, waving both arms like a windmill. Jonathan approached, marveling at the project. A solar system made from painted foam balls, each labeled in careful handwriting. "Caleb designed the rotation motor," Mason said, trying not to sound proud. "And Mason helped with the paint," Caleb added. Jonathan crouched down. "This is amazing. You two built this?" "Well," Mason said, "Mom helped glue Saturn. But I did Jupiter." Caleb grinned. "Mine's Neptune." Jonathan studied their faces, so eager, so alive with possibility. "I'm really proud of you both." Lena arrived a few minutes later, a bag of snacks in one hand, her eyes lighting up when she saw them. "They talked about this all week," she said, nodding toward the solar system. "I think they built their own galaxy to get your attention." Jonathan looked at her sincere. "They already have it." The boys moved on to look at classmates' projects, leaving Lena and Jonathan alone. "You're doing better than I expected," she said, folding her arms with a smile. "I'm doing better than I expected," he replied, running a hand through his hair. "It's hard, though." "It's real," she said quietly. They watched the boys for a long moment, Caleb now explaining comets to another parent with passionate hand gestures. "Some days, I still feel like I don't deserve this," Jonathan admitted, his voice low. "You're showing up," Lena replied. "That matters more than perfection." He nodded. "I just want them to know I'm here, that I'm not going anywhere." "You've come a long way from boardrooms and biotech," she teased gently. "Yeah. Turns out bedtime stories and school drop-offs are a tougher market." They shared a soft laugh. Then the school principal took the mic to announce awards and the moment passed, but it stayed with them in the air between heartbeats. That night, after the boys were asleep, Jonathan sat at Lena's kitchen table, staring at a drawing Caleb had slipped into his bag. A stick figure version of him with "My Dad" written in blocky crayon letters. He ran his fingers over the paper slowly, as if afraid it might vanish. He was learning. Slowly, imperfectly, but he was learning. And for the first time, he didn't feel like a man trying to fix the past. He felt like a father building a future. Jonathan stood in the courthouse corridor, his hands balled into fists in the pockets of his coat. The air was too cold for May, or maybe it was just the nerves crawling under his skin. Down the hall, Mason and Caleb sat on a bench beside Lena, their feet swinging above the tile floor, unaware of the legal storm that had been building behind closed doors. Lena gave him a reassuring glance, but there was tension in her eyes, like a violin string pulled too tight. "You sure you're ready for this?" she asked softly. Jonathan nodded, though he wasn't. Not really. "They're my sons. I have to be." A week ago, the letter had arrived. Crisp envelope, typed signature, no warmth. Lena's uncle, Raymond Barrett, was petitioning for guardianship. A retired military officer with a rigid worldview, Raymond claimed Jonathan had abandoned his responsibilities and was unfit to be a father. He didn't even bother to visit us when Lena was in the hospital, he'd told the court in his affidavit. And now he shows up like a hero? Jonathan had read the statement 3 times. Each word had felt like a blow to the gut. But what hurt worse was how carefully it omitted the truth. "Jonathan Miles," the clerk called. "You're up." He stepped into the courtroom with Lena beside him, her hand grazing his back, an anchor, a promise. Mason and Caleb remained outside with a family advocate. The courtroom was small, the air thick with tension. Judge Marlowe, a woman with sharp eyes and a gentler voice than expected, presided. At the far table, Raymond sat stiff and composed, his jaw set like granite. He wore his old military medals on a navy blazer, projecting authority. Jonathan took the stand first. His lawyer began gently. "Mr. Miles, tell us why you've decided to pursue custody, or at the very least shared guardianship." Jonathan cleared his throat. "Because they're my sons. Because I didn't know until recently that they even existed. And because once I did, walking away wasn't an option." Raymond scoffed under his breath, loud enough for the room to hear. The lawyer pressed on. "Can you explain the circumstances of your absence?" Jonathan nodded slowly. "Lena and we were young. We were in love, but life happened. I made choices I regret. She tried to contact me. Letters, phone calls, but I never received them. My assistant at the time..." He paused, the memory stinging. "Intercepted them. She thought she was protecting my time, my image. In reality, she cost me nearly a decade with my sons. And since discovering the truth, I've changed everything. I left my position as CEO. I spend every day with them now. School mornings, bedtime stories, homework, breakfast disasters, all of it. Not because I have to, because I want to, because they deserve a father who shows up not just in courtrooms, but at science fairs and doctor's appointments." Judge Marlowe studied him for a long moment, her gaze unreadable. Then she turned to Raymond. "Mr. Barrett, do you have anything to add?" Raymond stood. "Your Honor, I respect Mr. Miles's success, but good intentions don't erase absence. I was there when Lena went into early labor. I paid bills when she couldn't. And I've watched these boys grow up needing consistency, not emotional redemption arcs." Lena stiffened beside Jonathan, her hand gripping the edge of the table. "May I speak?" she asked. The judge nodded. Lena rose with quiet resolve. "My uncle has done more for us than I can ever repay," she began. "But what my boys need now isn't discipline or legacy. They need love. They need both their parents." Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. "Jonathan made mistakes. So did I. But he's shown up every day since. He's braided hair, mended broken toys, sat through school meetings. He's learning. And my sons, they already love him." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded letter. "This is a letter I wrote to the court in case I couldn't be here today. I meant every word then, and I stand by it now." The bailiff delivered it to the judge. Silence stretched thick as the judge read, her brow furrowing, her expression softening. "I'd like to hear from the boys," Judge Marlowe said suddenly, "with the guardian present." The advocate returned with Mason and Caleb, who looked around the room nervously. "Boys," the judge said gently, "can you tell me what you think of Mr. Miles?" Caleb was the first to speak. "He helps with math," he mumbled, "and makes pancakes, sort of." Mason added, "He makes us feel safe, like we matter." Judge Marlowe's lips curved ever so slightly. She dismissed them back to the advocate and turned to Raymond. "Mr. Barrett, you clearly care for your family, but guardianship is not a reward for loyalty. It's a decision about what's best for the children. And from everything I've heard today, that's their father." Raymond's mouth tightened, but he said nothing. The judge looked at Jonathan. "This is not a final custody ruling, but I'm granting joint guardianship effective immediately. Let's give these boys the chance to have a whole family." Jonathan exhaled for the first time in what felt like days. Lena squeezed his hand, and Mason ran into the courtroom just before the judge stood, wrapping his arms tightly around Jonathan's waist. "I knew they'd see," Mason whispered fiercely. Jonathan kissed the top of his head, his voice thick. "Me too, buddy. Me too." Spring had finally settled over the city like a soft sigh, stretching golden rays across every rooftop and playground. Jonathan Miles stood on the edge of Greenfield Park, the collar of his navy jacket turned up slightly against the breeze, his eyes fixed on two small figures racing through a patch of dandelions. Mason and Caleb had just finished their Saturday soccer practice, their cheeks pink with exertion, their laughter echoing across the grass. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind. Court hearings, guardian training sessions, late-night story times, and quiet moments with Lena that meant more than he could say. Jonathan had expected the transition to feel awkward, maybe even overwhelming. And it had been, at first. But slowly, deliberately, he was building something real, a life that wasn't just balanced by spreadsheets or stock options, but by morning cartoons, sticky fingers, and crayon drawings proudly taped to the fridge. "Jonathan." Lena's voice came softly behind him. She approached with a careful smile, her auburn hair pulled back in a simple braid, a reminder of the woman he'd loved and never quite stopped loving. "They've been asking if we can get ice cream." He turned to her, searching her face. "Didn't we just have lunch?" Lena chuckled, folding her arms across her chest. "Apparently, ice cream doesn't count as food, only joy." Jonathan smiled, the kind that made the corners of his eyes crease. "Well, I'm not about to stand in the way of joy." They strolled toward the bench where their jackets lay, and Lena leaned in just enough to be heard over the wind. "You've changed, you know." Jonathan looked at her carefully. "For the better?" She nodded slowly. "For the truer. I think this version of you was always in there, just buried beneath ambition and deadlines." His gaze dropped for a moment. "I was afraid," he admitted, his voice rough. "Afraid I'd never be enough for anyone. That if I didn't keep achieving, I'd lose whatever worth I had." Lena touched his arm gently. "You never had to prove anything to us. Just show up. Just be present." And he had been. Every day since the courtroom decision, Jonathan had taken time off work, sometimes rescheduling entire projects just to pick the boys up from school or help with bedtime routines. He hadn't just stepped into their lives, he'd stitched himself into the fabric of it. Later that evening, back at Lena's townhouse, Mason was sprawled across the living room floor working on a puzzle while Caleb sat on the couch sketching dinosaurs with meticulous focus. "Can we keep the lights off a little longer?" Mason asked, pointing toward the window. Outside, the sky was painted with sherbet tones, orange melting into lavender. Jonathan glanced at Lena, who nodded, and he pulled a blanket around both boys as they huddled by the windowsill. "I used to think sunsets were just the end of something," Jonathan said softly. "But now, I think they're promises, that something beautiful is still ahead." Caleb looked up, a smudge of pencil lead on his chin. "Do you promise to stay even when it's not pretty?" The question lodged in Jonathan's throat like a stone. He crouched in front of them, eye level. "I promise to stay when it's hard, when it's messy, when you're mad at me, or sad, or scared. I'll still be there. I didn't come back to visit. I came back to stay." The boys didn't say anything, but Mason leaned forward, wrapping his small arms around Jonathan's neck in a silent, fierce hug. Caleb followed, burying his face in Jonathan's shoulder. Lena watched from the kitchen doorway, her eyes brimming. Later, after the boys were tucked in, after Jonathan had read Goodnight Moon with exaggerated voices and Caleb had asked for water twice just to stay awake longer, Lena found Jonathan sitting alone on the back porch. The stars were starting to pierce the darkening sky. "I'm selling the penthouse," he said without turning. "I've talked to a realtor already. It never felt like home anyway. Lena stepped out beside him. "Where will you go?" "Somewhere near here, close enough to pick them up from school, maybe even with a yard. I want them to have a place they can ride bikes, scrape knees, grow vegetables, whatever kids are supposed to do." "And what about work?" she asked cautiously. He looked up at the stars. "Still mine, but it won't own me anymore. My sons are my legacy now, not my title." They sat in silence for a moment, and then Lena said what had lingered between them for weeks. "Do you ever wish we'd done it differently?" Jonathan's voice was low, honest. "I used to, but if we had, maybe I wouldn't be this man. Maybe I wouldn't understand how precious this second chance really is." She reached for his hand. "Then let's not waste it." The porch light flickered, casting their shadows across the wooden slats. From inside, the boys' sleepy voices carried faintly, something about dragons and dreamlands. Jonathan looked over at Lena, his heart full in a way it had never been before. "I came late," he whispered, "but I'm not leaving. Not again." And for the first time in years, he believed it.